Welcome to this lecture on bone health, vitamin D, calcium and phosphate. I'm Dr. Andrew Chappell. So, before we get into this lecture, just to make sure that we get into the right frame of mind and start thinking about bone health, vitamin D and calcium, I want you to pause the video just for a second and have a think. How does bone health influence, or rather how is bone health influenced by vitamin D? And also, can you think of some calcium and phosphorus rich foods? And what would be the consequence of having a diet which is low in those types of foods? So pause the video, have a little think about that. And then once you've completed this task, then you can go on and continue with the lecture. Okay, so assuming we've done that little task, this is what we're going to try and achieve with our session today. I'm going to talk about bones and their structure. I'm going to talk about peak bone mineral density. I'm also going to talk about calcium, vitamin D and phosphorus and their role in bone metabolism. I'm going to talk about different dietary sources of calcium, vitamin D and phosphorus. I'm going to talk about the nutritional requirements associated with those particular micronutrients. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So, here is bone, and this is the structure of bone. So this is your sort of classical long bone. If you imagine a bone that you find perhaps in your femur, it's got a long section here from the top all the way down to the bottom called the diaphysis, and then at the end of that diaphysis you've got the epiphysis, both the proximal, which is closest to the body, and then you'll have the distal at the other end of it. Now, bone we sort of traditionally think of as a hard substance. However, you get different types of bone. We've got this compact stuff, which if you look at our diagram here, makes up a strong surface on the outside of the bone. Within that, you've also got this spongy type bone we call cancellous bone, okay? That bone has got much more of a shock absorbing property, not as brittle as that harder bone, the compact bone we've got on the outside of it as well. Bone we always sort of traditionally think of as a really solid hard substance, but when you look at that spongy cancellous bone, what you can see is it's got like a honeycomb style structure, and that gives it strength while also reducing the weight of it at the same time. Now, bone is metabolically active, so what that means is it's always constantly turning over, and because it's always constantly turning over, it's got some blood supply so that we can get nutrients delivered to and from it, but it's also a major depository or reservoir, if you like, for stem cells. So within the bone you've got this large area, the medullary cavity, where we have our bone marrow stored, and then cells which live in here, they will go on and they'll become stem cells and they'll differentiate around the body. Calcium and phosphate, they largely make up the majority of bone, but there's other stuff in there as well. So as well as calcium and phosphorus, and there's also some magnesium in there as well. That makes up to around about 70% of bone, and they form these things called mineral salts, okay? And it's around about a 2.16 to 1 ratio in terms of the calcium to phosphorus which is in your bone, okay? The majority of calcium, I think we're talking around about 99% of the body's content is in the bone and the teeth. Phosphorus is not quite as much, but it's still around about 75% of the body's supply of phosphorus is within bone. Now the other stuff that we've got within bone, we've got proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and we've got collagen fibers. Okay, so glycoproteins and proteoglycans, these are like kind of sticky protein structures that we find within our bone. And then collagen fibers, well, we all sort of know collagens as connective tissue, which binds things together. The cells that we have in our bone, we've got osteocytes, we've got osteoblasts, we've also got some other cells called osteoclasts as well. And it's this process that we call ossification or osteogenesis, which is responsible for laying down new bone tissue, so laying down new calcium and phosphorus, and it's osteoblasts that do that job. And then the other cells we have are called osteoclasts. They're responsible for bone reabsorption. So we call it resorption. And what they do is they'll break down new bone tissue, or rather old bone tissue, releasing calcium and phosphorus into our bloodstream if need be, and then we remodel as we go on, right? So we replace our skeleton bit by bit by bit, and over 20 years, then you might replace something in the region of 500 grams worth of skeleton. So we're always turning over. There's microfractures, there's breaks, there's the need for more phosphorus and calcium in our body. So we're always laying it down and building up new bone as we go on. So it's metabolically active as a tissue. Now, most of the growth in our skeleton comes as we're children, and what happens is we're consistently laying down new bone tissue. So your osteoblasts are mineralizing cartilage, which is there already, because as we grow, what happens is our bones start off nice and soft, and they're largely cartilage, as you can see from our example that we've got here with our schematic. And then over time, what happens is that cartilage gets mineralized, and then over time what happens is the diaphysis gets mineralized first, the epiphysis at the end slowly gets mineralized over time second, and then there's this place we call the epiphyseal plate, and that gets mineralized last until the bone fuses from there. So I've got a little stat here, and we can see we're probably replacing, on average, because of these metabolic growth processes, around about between 5 to 7% of our bone mass a week. So we're always liberating calcium and phosphorus. We're always laying down new bone tissue as the demand requires. And the biggest stint in our life where we'll do most of this is during our years when we grow from children to adolescence to eventually become adults. Okay, so I've mentioned this already. Most of the calcium within our body is in bone tissue. However, calcium has other functions within the body as well. Notably, from my perspective, I'm interested in exercise physiology. Calcium is involved in muscular contractions and allows our sliding filaments to pass over each other as a result of signaling within our cells. But it's also involved in nerve impulses, particularly in solitary conduction. There's enzymatic activation. It's important for blood clotting, ion transport, neurotransmitters, for hormones as well, okay? And because of that, we need to consistently maintain a supply of it in our bloodstream. Not a huge amount, but we do need a supply. So as it says here, we're looking at trying to maintain between around about 9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. So in order to do that, we've got to manage bone metabolism and calcium levels along with phosphate levels in our blood. And the way your body does that is via a couple of different methods, okay? So the first one I'm going to mention here is for something called parathyroid hormone. So your thyroid gland, which sits in your neck, if you were to flip it over or look at it from a posterior perspective, you see there's 4 little glands in the back of the thyroid, and we call that our parathyroid. Okay? Whereas our thyroid gland also has specialist C cells, which are responsible for regulating bone metabolism as well. Now, your parathyroid is responsible for releasing parathyroid hormone, which in all our slides hereafter you'll just see is PTH. And what that does is it tells your body's osteoclasts to start breaking down your cells, so bone reabsorption, and releasing calcium into the bloodstream so that we can maintain calcium homeostasis. Okay? So if calcium levels in the blood get too low, what happens is PTH, parathyroid hormone, is released, tells our osteoclasts to start breaking down that bone, release it in the bloodstream so that we've got calcium available. It does some other things too, but we'll come on to that later. If our levels get too high, then what happens is our thyroid gland, our C cells in there, release another hormone called calcitonin, and then that tells our body to start depositing calcium into our bones or to start excreting excess calcium and to stop absorbing quite as much calcium. So those are 2 major hormones involved in regulating calcium metabolism. Now, bones in terms of health. So one of the major challenges facing us when it comes to bone health and bone disease is meeting the challenge of osteoporosis. And this is where we lose bone mineral density over time. Okay? So, I talked earlier on about this concept of bone mineral density or peak bone mass. And as we grow from being infants all the way up to adolescence and reach our early 20s, we're consistently laying down bone mass and increasing the density of our skeleton. We're mineralizing it consistently, provided that we have suitable lifestyle factors in place, e.g. exercise, good nutrition, free from disease. Men typically lay down more bone mineral than women. Some of this is thought to be as part of sex hormones, so testosterone seems to be particularly potent at helping you lay down bone mass. As we age, however, we lose bone mass. So once we're moving into our 40s, our bone mass starts to decline. And what we're aiming to do as healthy human beings and as adults is to lay down as much bone mass as we possibly can in our early years to achieve the highest peak bone mineral density we can, to avoid that decline in later life where we can end up with low bone mass, and if it gets too low, osteoporosis, where we're at risk of breaks. There's a few things worth highlighting on here. So we've got the menopause, which occurs in women, maybe around the age of 40 to 45. So there's a loss of estrogen, and that affects our bone mineral density. And many women can find themselves creeping into this low bone mass zone, and if it continues, they can end up with osteoporosis. If we end up in a situation whereby we don't build enough bone mass in our early years, so from our teenage years into our early 20s, then we can end up with low peak bone mass, so that when we move into our later life stages and our bone mass starts to decline, we can end up with osteoporosis. So it's really important that we lay down as much bone mass as we possibly can in our early years. The other graphic that I've got on here is to do with the gain in bone mineral density alongside increases in height velocity in children. So as height increases, it spikes at various different points, different for boys and girls, and then there are obviously differences in terms of that peak for the bone mineral density between the two. There are lots of conditions that could potentially lead to people having a reduction in bone mass. So there's genetic conditions. Some people are more susceptible than others, but there's also a whole host of chronic illnesses which could potentially affect bone mineral density. Diseases of the thyroid in particular, because the thyroid gland is so important in calcium metabolism, that can also have an effect. Diseases of the bowel, so if we've got issues with the absorption of calcium in our body, that can potentially affect our ability to lay down bone mass. Diseases of the kidneys as well. Eating disorders, if we're not consuming enough nutrient and we end up in wasting situations, so the skeleton can lose density because we're just not getting enough nutrition, this can be a potential issue. And there's many, many other ones which can potentially cause us issues as well. Aside from having a diet which is optimal to ensure that we've got all the nutrients there to build the bone in the first place, the other thing which makes a difference is exercise. I can't stress this enough, okay? Bone grows as a result of metabolic stresses placed on it, mechanical tension and gravitational forces, okay? Which is why astronauts lose bone mineral density when they're up in space. So this sort of idea of the organism being perfectly adapted to its environment is extremely true, okay? Unless you tell your body to meet the demand to build bigger and thicker bones, e.g. via exercise, it doesn't have the need to do it. So exercise is an important component, right? It places mechanical loads on a skeleton that stimulate osteoblasts to lay down more mineralization, more bone. Exercise tells your body to secrete sex hormones, which tells your body to lay down more bone, but also to maintain that bone tissue as well. It upregulates pathways and signaling pathways associated with it. And at the same time, just having more muscle mass and doing the exercise puts contractual stress on the bone, which causes it to lay down more mineralization. So exercise is extremely, extremely important, right? We've got the components, we've got calcium, we've got vitamin D, we've got phosphorus. We can consume these things, but unless there's a demand to mineralize that bone, then our body won't necessarily do anything with it. Okay, so that's some basic bone metabolism. It's a little bit about exercise. But let's talk about vitamin D now and where that fits into this story. So we all know about vitamin D. It's the sunshine molecule. Fat soluble, comes from fatty foods. Get in eggs, margarines, meat, dairy. There's also plant sources of it as well, most notably mushrooms. Okay? So vitamin D. So cholecalciferol. So calciferol. This type we call vitamin D3. Get it again from animals, from mushrooms. Then there's ergocalciferol, known as D2. You get that from plants, okay? D3 is the active form we get from the diet. D3 is also the type we get from sunlight, okay? And what happens is, we absorb the vitamin D3 either in our diet or on our skin. I'll come to that in a second. And we store it in the liver. We store it as something called 25-oxy-2-D3, okay? Or calcidol. Okay? Now you can see there's some biochemical pathways going on here. We've got something called 7-dehydrocholesterol. UVB light acts on it, and that's how we get vitamin B3, pre-vitamin D. Combine that with skin temperature, so if there's enough heat there alongside the UVB lights, then that's how we get the conversion to D3 within our body, okay? If there's a demand for it, our kidneys will convert that D3 within our body, calcidol, into calcitrol, okay? That is the active form within our body, and that takes place within our kidneys. Okay, so UVB light is important for the conversion of pre-vitamin D into vitamin D3, right? Alongside heat. Okay, so this is important. Provided we've got the right wavelength, the UVB light, and the heat, then we can convert 7-dehydrocholesterol and pre-vitamin D3 to vitamin D3, the cholecalciferol, okay? Provided we've got the right temperature and the right light. Now, if you live at latitudes north of 40 degrees or south of 40 degrees, like we do in the UK, there's only enough UVB light during the summer months, early spring, or rather late spring, through to early autumn. Okay, so between March and September, there's enough UVB light to allow you to have this conversion take place. Out with that time, there's not enough UVB light. So our ability to synthesize vitamin D from skin, from sunlight, is reduced. Also worth considering are people's skin types, okay? We've got the Fitzpatrick skin type scale here. In fact, I think I've got it on our slide. And we'll come to that later. And the darker your skin is, basically, the more your ability to convert vitamin, pre-vitamin D3 into vitamin D is compromised. Also, if you cover up your skin a lot, then you'll be compromising your ability to carry out these reactions and potentially influencing the amount of circulating vitamin D within your body. So let's talk about sources and requirements. So, if we say live too far north, which is most of Europe, we should say, or too far south, so we're looking at, say, the southern tip of Argentina, parts of New Zealand, then we don't get enough UVB light all year round. So around about 6 months of the year, we're not getting enough. Stay closer to the equator, we're getting enough UVB rays. How much UVB you need? Probably around about 15 to 30 minutes worth of exposure between 11 and 3 p.m. Okay, on the arms and on the face. That's what we're looking at to make sure that we're not deficient. Again, we have to factor in skin type. So the darker your skin, the higher your chance of deficiency. However, this is offset against risk of skin cancer, of course. So, if we are going to go outside, then we need to make sure that we are protecting ourselves potentially, because we also have to make sure that we don't get skin cancer, okay? So guidelines from Cancer Research UK is do spend some time in the shade between peak hours, but at the same time, we do have to get outside and maintain those vitamin D levels. Here are dietary sources. So if we can't get enough vitamin D, we can also get it from our diet. And good sources are animal-based sources. So cod liver oil is really high in vitamin D. It's probably because it's concentrated. Fish, salmon, particularly wild, carp, you can see on here, very, very high. Beef, pork, lamb, and offal are all high in vitamin D. So these are organs. Eggs, good source of vitamin D as well. Dairy, good source, particularly milk powder. Plant-based sources, not quite as good. However, there's a couple of strange ones. So reindeer lichen, for example, has got huge amounts of vitamin D in it. And if you're wondering what that is, that's this kind of what I would describe as like a moss down here on the page. There are certain types of mushrooms which have got high vitamin D content, which kind of makes sense because mushrooms grow in the sunlight, don't they? But ever looking at vegetable-based sources, most of the time it's coming from fortified foods. Okay, so we're adding vitamin D to things. Dark chocolate, interestingly, good vitamin D content. Here's some more examples. These are all scientific papers. Reference on here of different vitamin D concentrations based on different organs and different cuts of beef. You can see it does depend on where you take the cut. Beef liver here, very high concentration of vitamin D. Pork liver again very high. Pork very high on here. So offal are good sources. And when you think the liver being high in it, it makes sense because again that's the storage region for our vitamin D in the human body. So it works out the same when we're looking at animals as well. But it'll depend on the season when you're carrying out your avatar work, your butchery on these animals as well. But offal good sources of vitamin D. Okay, so we measure vitamin D based on 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels within your blood. Okay. If we're concerned that people are vitamin D deficient, then you can ask them about the vitamin D content of their diet. You can ask them about their sunlight exposure. You can also ask them about weakness in their muscles and symptoms associated with that, if you're suspecting that. But you can also measure them, like I say, using blood markers. And depending on the method that you use, or rather the institution that you want to go with, we've got the Institute of Medicine, we've got the Endocrine Society, we've got the Osteoporosis Foundation. You can see there are slightly different cut-offs for what are described as deficient, insufficient, and sufficient, yeah? However, if you are less than 30 nanomolars per litre, that is generally considered as being deficient and at risk of deficiency, and probably high risk for things like osteoporosis. So, what do we know in the UK about vitamin D consumption? Well, if you look at vitamin D amounts measured by our biomarker, we can see that quite a lot of the population is potentially deficient. So children, 4 to 10, 11 to 18, up to 23%, and then adults, 19 to 64-year-olds, 18%, and then 12% for adults over the age of 65. Particularly concerning because we want to lay down as much bone mass as we can in our early years as children, and then as we get older, post 65, we're losing bone mass, So we want to make sure that we've got enough vitamin D in our diet to ensure that we maintain our bone mineral density. So what are the requirements? Well, in our diet, SACAN recommends around about 10 microgram per day is what we should be consuming, right? Lots of food products are fortified. Average person is consuming in the UK around about between 7.7 to 10 micrograms a day. Meat, spreads, and cereal products are your main source of vitamin D. Now, guidance around supplementation. The UK government says that everyone rather should consider taking a daily vitamin D supplement in the autumn and winter. So they should consider taking it. It's not an outright recommendation, it's just a consideration. They've stopped short of saying you should absolutely take it. But there is some high-risk population, and they say they should take a vitamin D supplement throughout the year. So children, all babies if they're not having infant formula, if you've got dark skin, and then if you are pregnant, then you should be considering a vitamin D supplement. So that's vitamin D. We're going to talk a little bit about metabolism and how it interacts with calcium in a minute. So at the start of this, I asked you to think about, well, what foods are good sources of calcium? And you should have all been thinking dairy, yeah, as a good source of calcium. However, there are other sources of calcium as well. And a lot of our foods in the UK, and this is data from the US, is fortified. Okay, so we add calcium to lots of foods alongside vitamin D as well. So a lot of people who drink soya milk or milk alternatives, plant juices, will be consuming their calcium that way. Breads high in calcium as well. You get it from green leafy vegetables, so broccoli, kale, good sources at the same time. But overwhelmingly, best source is dairy. I mean, we've got tofu at the top there, but again, that will be fortified with calcium. Here's more data on this. You can see, instead of a bar graph, you can see it now. It's a table representation. Baked beans, interestingly, high amount of calcium in them, so 120 megs of calcium. Spinach, good source of calcium as well. Breakfast cereal fortified, orange juice fortified. But again, overwhelmingly, we're looking at dairy-based products as our main source of calcium in our diets. Fish is a good source of calcium as well. Now, in the UK, calcium intake isn't so much of an issue. So intakes from the NDS, we're seeing around about 807 micrograms a day. You only need around about 700 micrograms a day. Although that intake is dependent on your stage of life. So if you're lactating, if you're growing, if you're approaching menopause, if you're high risk for osteoporosis, if you've got bowel diseases where absorption might be compromised, it makes sense to have a higher intake, and that's what the UK recommendations are, okay? So your intake changes depending on your life stage. Children growing, teenagers need more calcium than adults who have reached their peak growth already. Okay, so I mentioned this already about calcium metabolism. So calcium's important, right? We need it for our bones, but we also need to maintain a certain amount within our bloodstream as well. And that's regulated via parathyroid hormone and via calcitonin, yeah? So, we've talked about vitamin D. one of the things that parathyroid hormone does is it starts demineralizing bone to release calcium into the bloodstream, right? The other things it does though is it increases your uptake of calcium. So it tells your body to start absorbing more calcium from your gut. It does this by interacting with vitamin D. It activates it. It tells your body to turn that vitamin D, which is stored in your liver, into active vitamin D in your kidney. So that's what's happening there. It also tells our kidneys to reduce the excretion of calcium at the same time. So it's saying stop excreting it. Calcitonin, as I mentioned already, does the opposite, yeah? What it's doing is it's saying we need this calcium, so let's reduce the excretion of any calcium, but let's also reduce the bone demineralization as well, so the breakdown at the same time. Not necessarily telling us to lay down new bone tissue. That's what's going to happen when we do our exercise and tell our body to remodel that bone tissue, because there's a demand for it, okay? So I mentioned this already. This is vitamin D metabolism, so we get it on our skin, converted from pre-vitamin D to vitamin D3, enters our bloodstream alongside our dietary sources, stored in the liver. Parathyroid hormone is released. Maybe there's a lack of calcium in our bloodstream. Our body detects that. Thereafter that, our kidneys convert our vitamin D3 into its active form, calcitrol. So it goes from calcitrol to calcitrol. Calcitrol, being the active form, and then that's telling our body to take up more calcium in our intestinal tract, to refrain from excreting it in our kidneys, the calcium that is. So we get a greater uptake of calcium, but also phosphorus within our gut. The kidneys are also going to have a signal which has gone to it from parathyroid hormone, and that, or rather our parathyroid hormone is going to signal to our osteoblasts, which are going to tell us to start breaking down bone so we can release enough calcium into our bloodstream as well, right? Now what happens at this point here is you might get mineralization, so it might get released and then you get some bone remodeling and more is laid down, or the calcium might go for muscular contractions, or it may go for neuromuscular function. It just depends on the requirement for the calcium. One thing that's worth noting though is that if we start to get lots of phosphorus being released at the same time, so lots of phosphate will bind the calcium, so we can end up in this sort of spiral that takes place whereby if we have too much phosphate being released, then we have to start releasing more calcium, because that bound calcium we can't do anything with it, yeah? So we have to be conscious of that as well. Okay, calcium absorption is complicated. There's several ways in which we can absorb calcium. There's several what we call stimulators, and then there's several what we call inhibitors as well, okay? So, certain sugars, glucose and galactose, actually increase your absorption of calcium, which makes sense because glucose and galactose combined are lactose. So if you're consuming dairy, you've got some sugars there which at the same time enhance the absorption. Again, it makes sense. Some calcium absorption takes place via sodium dependent transport. So if we've got enough sodium in the diet, that increases our absorption. Some of it takes place via something called calcium flux. So it's just passive diffusion. It just goes straight across our membrane. We've got the calcium sensing receptor, that's sensing the amount of calcium circulating in our lumen, and then that will get transported across our luminal wall into our cell, and there's local sensors at play that will do that. Inhibitors, okay, or rather, let's continue to talk about enhancers. So we've also talked about parathyroid hormone and vitamin D as well. Now there are things which will inhibit calcium uptake, okay? So iron will inhibit calcium uptake. Too much iron cancels out some calcium uptake. Tannins, phytates, oxalates all interfere with calcium transport, okay? Sodium deoxycholate, okay? Those are secondary bile salts. So if you're on a very high protein, high fat diet, you get a lot of bile salts, this could potentially negatively affect your ability to uptake calcium. Also, the amount of calcium you have circulating in your blood and in your intestinal tract influences calcium uptake as well, because it operates as a bit of a negative feedback loop, okay? So too much, it will stop absorbing the amount of calcium as well. So we've got lots of different mechanisms which will influence both the absorption and the inhibition of calcium within our body. I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go on. Oh, amino acids, again, many of these amino acids are actually found in animal-based products, so particularly isoleucine, leucine, they are branched chain amino acids. Phos, that's something called fructooligosaccharides. We find these in human milk, so unsurprising. Galactooligosaccharides, I would be surprised if they did the same in infants. Inhibition, well, I've mentioned lots of these already, so we're going to take our calcium supplement in the morning. Probably makes it good, means it's a good idea to not take it with coffee or with tea, because that might potentially inhibit our absorption. Tannins are also present in wines. Caffeine's an interesting one. This is probably because it is a diuretic and it pushes fluids through our body, potentially increasing the excretion from here. So we have interfering factors as well. So another thing that's worth mentioning, it's not all about vitamin D with calcium and bone. Vitamin K2 actually stimulates the uptake of calcium into bone as well. So there's something called osteocalcin, binds the calcium to the bone, and vitamin K2 is responsible for some of this reaction taking place as well. But remember, we've talked about different mechanisms by which calcium is absorbed. It's how we see bone being demineralized, but we have to have a stimulus, a need for us to lay down that new bone tissue. So it's not enough just for us to have the calcium in our diet. We need to make sure there's a demand for it from the exercise component. So that's calcium. Let's talk about phosphorus now and sources and requirements. Okay, so in terms of sources, okay, the UK diet is not replete in phosphorus. It's not an issue. It's found in two sort of different types. You get organic and inorganic. Organic is the type that you typically find in food items. Inorganic are food additives. These are things which people add to food items, usually ultra-processed food items. So Coca-Cola, for example, we add phosphorus to it. I'm going to talk about this later on. But animal-based products, extremely bioavailable sources, right? So we can absorb these things, no problem at all. Good sources, we've got milk again, dairy is good, fish is good. Again, but there's some other examples on here. We've got lentils, we've got nuts, we've got beans, we've got breads as well. So the UK diet isn't actually replete in these. And given that we probably consume, or we know we do, consume too much ultra-processed foods, phosphates are used for texture, to emulsify things, as preservatives, as anti-caking agents, right? So it's abundant in our diet, and it's not really an issue in terms of us consuming enough phosphates. In terms of requirements, you can see it is dependent on your age. And again, as we grow, there's a demand for it, right? Teenage boys need more than teenage girls. They grow higher, or rather they grow taller. Adults, both men and women, slightly lower intake from here, but you can see UK estimates for consuming around about 1.4 grams a day. So we need, say, almost a third of that. Potassium, we can take it up via both passive transport, goes straight across the luminal wall, but there's also sodium dependent transport as well. Most phosphorus is in the bone, 15% is in tissues or extracellular fluid. Phosphate, I mean, we use it in energy contractions, so ATP, most notably, adenosine triphosphate, we're using it regularly to carry out these contractions to stimulate motion, really, all the time. So high demand for it in our diet. Calcitrol enhances phosphate, bone and gut absorption at the same time, whereas parathyroid hormone increases bone breakdown and the release of phosphates, yeah? There's a hormone produced by bones called FGF23, that's fibro growth factor 23. That increases our excretion of phosphate as well. Okay, I've only got this brief slide here on phosphate, but where we can see issues with phosphate is in kidney disease. So once your kidney function drops to around about 40%, then we've got some issues. And we're seeing issues with the renal retention of phosphate and calcium, so they don't function properly, but we're also seeing issues with the conversion of vitamin D into the active form as well. So we see a reduction in calcium absorption as a result, and we might also see a reduction in phosphate excretion at the same time. So these things can build up in our body. We start to see an increase in things like parathyroid hormone at the same time because we're not absorbing enough. So we start to get an increase in calcium being resorbed from the bone, and we can see continuous loss of calcium and phosphate within the bone and continued circulation of calcium phosphate in the bloodstream. And as I mentioned before, phosphate binds calcium. If we're struggling to excrete it, then our body's going to try and release more and more calcium. We get more and more release of parathyroid hormone, so our bodies continually tell us to demineralize bone. So people who have got kidney issues can suffer from things like osteoporosis and bone demineralization as a consequence of these things, and it can potentially lead to the parathyroid hormone gland actually being removed to manage this. They might have to follow low phosphate diets as a consequence as well, and usually the people who are in these conditions are going to be working with specialist dietitians to manage these things. Okay, this takes us to the end of the lecture. So a few things to mention. Bone is always undergoing remodeling, right? Osteoclasts, they're laying down bone. Osteoclasts, they're taking up bone. Osteocytes are in there, they become part of the bone matrix, okay? But we're always building it up, breaking it down, building it up, breaking it down, right? Vitamin D, calcium and phosphorus, they all play an important role in determining that bone quality, right? Vitamin D enhances the absorption of calcium. Vitamin D, you get it from the sunlight and from dietary sources. Our calcium uptake is regulated by parathyroid hormone and vitamin D, which also interact with phosphate metabolism. Our main source of vitamin D is sunlight, although getting enough of it can be an issue. But the UK diet, thankfully, has got enough calcium and phosphate in it, so that's not an issue, for some people at least. Anti-nutrients impair the uptake of calcium, so we've got to be aware of that. Okay, so there's a few other things here worth going and have a look at. So go and check out these further readings on here. So things which I think you might find interesting is, what is bone health like at northern latitudes? Do you see more breaks? Is there less bone mineral density? How does it affect the vitamin D content of their diet and their blood? What is the vitamin D content of submariners? They spend a lot of time below the surface, below the sea surface. They don't get a lot of vitamin D. What are their vitamin D levels like? Do they see more breaks? Interesting stuff. What about alkaline diets? If we've got too much phosphorus in our diet or too much calcium in our diet, should we be demineralizing our bone to try and regulate the pH balance? Does this mean anything? And then I've got another paper here on low phosphate diets as well, and its relationship with chronic kidney disease. Okay, thank you for your time. Hopefully you found this interesting. One last thing I would just like to say, if you did find this of value, please do go and check out this little QR code here and leave me some feedback. Just scan it on the teaching. Hopefully you found this interesting. Happy to take suggestions on these going forward and how we might be able to improve our sessions. Thank you very much for your time. I'm Dr. Andrew Chappell. Thank you very much.